Resident Evil 3 is one of the weirdest games Capcom has ever remade, because unlike Resident Evil 2, this wasn't a game people universally demanded a remake for. The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis released in 1999, and it was always the chaotic younger sibling of Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 was a carefully crafted survival horror masterpiece. Resident Evil 3 then told Capcom, hey, people like this, why don't we just make it more? You once again return to Raccoon City, except this time, instead of playing a rookie cop, Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield, you play as Jill Valentine, one of the last surviving members of STARS. And immediately, the game does something so different. Unlike Resident Evil 2, which slowly built tension inside the police station, Resident Evil 3 Remake starts by throwing you directly into the apocalypse. Buildings are exploding, people are being eaten alive in the streets. Being thrown into the beast's belly tells you that this game isn't going to be slow-paced. Before we finish that thought process, Nemesis shows up. Now, before we continue, we need to establish something very important. Don't get it twisted, Mr. X was terrifying, but Nemesis is a straight menace. Mr. X felt like a machine carrying out a task, whereas Nemesis feels like a dickhead whose sole purpose in life is to make Jill's day god awful. Whilst Mr. X slowly walks towards you, Nemesis says fuck that and sprints at Mach 3 towards you. Remember how Mr. X was stopped by walls and, floors? Well, Nemesis believes that walls and floors are a mindset and fucking punts multiple objects through them, including Jill. Nemesis also uses weapons, which is different for Umbrella's arsenal. The opening 40 minutes are genuinely incredible because of this. Capcom understands that panic is one of the core identifiers for Resident Evil 3. You're constantly moving through collapsing streets while Nemesis appears at random intervals to completely destroy whatever sense of safety you thought you had. There's one moment where you think you've escaped him, only for him to immediately rocket launch your ass and then burn an entire apartment complex. It's so wildly different and such a wide swing that Capcom took, and yet it worked. Kinda. You see, whilst Mr. X was constant menace that followed you to the ends of the earth, Nemesis feels like a scripted menace. Whilst there's a good possibility that he'll turn up anywhere, it'll always be where Capcom wants it to be. Because of this, Nemesis doesn't have the same draw that Mr. X had. That being said, the biggest difference between Resident Evil 2 and 3 is the pacing. Resident Evil 2 is a slow, methodical survival horror game. Every hallway feels dangerous because the resources are scarce, and enemies are durable enough to make every bullet matter. Resident Evil 3, meanwhile, feels like an action game with a survival horror game coat over the top of it. Jill moves faster, dodging is introduced and enemies are way more aggressive, and the game drops the exploration for a constant adrenaline rush that pushes you forever forward. There's barely any downtime because Capcom clearly wanted this game to feel more action focused without turning into Resident Evil 5 or 6, where Chris starts punching tectonic plates for the shits and gigs. And honestly, the dodge mechanic is utter shit. Whilst I do give Capcom props for introducing something so different, I do have to condemn them because this mechanic is so janky. There's so many times where I press it and it's just clearly not responsive. The only way to make it palatable is to get Chris's handbook, of which you have to finish the game first before you can even get it, and even then it's still a load of crap. I'm so happy that Capcom changed this Resident Evil 4 remake. It's one of the only good few things about that game. Especially because zombies in this game are somehow even more irritating than Resident Evil 2. But not because they don't die, it's more towards how this game is laid out. You see, Your Honor, The map is laid out the same as Resident Evil 2, but the difference is you only backtrack about once or twice, whereas Resident Evil 2 Remake, you easily go over the same place about 30 to 40 times. Whereas with this game, you go over it maybe twice if you're lucky before Nemesis shows up. While the combat feels fantastic, this is also where the remake starts running into its main and very prominent problems. Resident Evil 3 Remake is short. I don't mean, oh, that was fairly quick for a Resident Evil game. I mean, this game feels like Capcom pushed this through the development period hard, which is actually what happened. I actually remember when this game came out. Resident Evil 2 had just come out in my mind, and then just a year later, Resident Evil 3 Remake came out, and I thought, oh, this is a DLC for Resident Evil 2. This is them teasing what's to come. But then, because this was during COVID, I thought to myself, oh, Capcom wanted the money, so they released it as its own little thing. Only to find out years later, when I was going through my Resident Evil phase, that this was its own standalone game, and it was developed alongside 2, but it was clearly pushed to the side to make sure that 2 hit its quota. It's a shame that locations got cut and that this game without cutscenes only runs for about a quarter of the length of the Resident Evil 4 remake, and even then that's being generous. Mercenaries being removed and Nemesis feeling more like a scripted menace makes all of this game feel so low quality. Don't get it twisted, the original Resident Evil 3 wasn't massively long either, but the remake cuts entire sections from the original game. The clock tower, gone. The park area, being transferred into another fucking world. Several Nemesis encounters either out the window entirely or turned into scripted boss fights. And this is the biggest issue with the remake overall. Nemesis is somehow less threatening than Mr. X, which is completely backwards in my mind. The problem is that Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 felt dynamic. He roams the police station naturally and changes how you play the game. Nemesis, meanwhile, is heavily scripted. He appears during specific chase sequences, screams a bit, destroys a wall, and then disappears until the next cutscene says, oh, you're allowed to come back. The illusion breaks faster because you eventually realise, oh, this is the section that's going to be scripted, right, let's get this over and done with. And that hurts because when Nemesis is allowed to roam freely during the early game, it's absolutely terrifying. Hearing him sprinting towards you, flamethrower goes off and the explosions are clearly behind you, is absolute cinema. It's just a shame that you're too busy shitting yourself to even notice what's going on. But the game barely lets the system breathe before moving on. And that is the bulk of Resident Evil 3's entire problem. Everything is massively rushed. The downtown area at the start is genuinely fantastic. It captures the same interconnected design philosophy that made RPD from Resident Evil 2 so memorable. The shortcuts unlock naturally, the puzzles are simple but satisfying, and exploring the ruined city while trying to avoid Nemesis creates such amazing tension. And then all of a sudden, Capcom just stops caring. Before you know it, you're already underground, then in the hospital, then the lab. Oh, look at that, the credits are rolling. It's so bizarre because Capcom feels as though they've just completely forgotten the middle third of the game. Now, to be fair, the hospital section absolutely fucks, but I'm not gonna lie, it's very basic. Playing as Carlos was fun because it feels like a Resident Evil game. Scavenging for materials, finding key cards, this is what Resident Evil 3 should have been. But good things don't last long, and my god does the hospital defense section end up as just an amalgamation of a mess. It feels like Capcom forgot that this was a survival horror game, not just a tower defense game. I wish this was a one-off moment, but it ends up falling into later games and becomes some of the worst parts in all subsequent games. Luckily, the game moves at a breakneck pace, so we don't actually have to spend long doing this. Then we have the boss fights, which we do genuinely have some fantastic visual boss fights. Nemesis throughout the entire game is constantly mutating, and it perfectly encapsulates Resident Evil's obsession with body horror, turning into complete flesh thing by the finale. But gameplay wise, a lot of Resident Evil games end up boiling down to shoot glowing thing until the boss falls over and dies, which unfortunately becomes repetitive very quickly. Resident Evil has always had dumb final form boss fights, and that's part of the charm of Resident Evil. By the end of every game, some scientist inevitably turns into an angry meatball with eyeballs glowing out of his fucking kneecaps. But Resident Evil 3 leans harder into spectacle rather than horror. And while that makes for an exciting set piece, it also means that the game loses the suffocating tension that made Resident Evil 2 special. Because fear in Resident Evil 2 came from the claustrophobia and the tension of landing your shots. Fear in Resident Evil 3 mostly comes from having to replay certain sections, which is why I sit here and I have to tell you that Resident Evil 3 Remake is not good, and it is not the standard of Resident Evil games. You can tell exactly at what point Capcom stopped caring for the pacing, as this game does something that no other Resident Evil game does, and it reuses time cards from other games. Since this game's pacing and story takes place over something like 4 days, whereas Resident Evil 2 takes the pace of 1 night. I hate this, and I think this is the laziest Capcom has ever been when it comes to Resident Evil. Even if you don't like 6, you have to admit it is just so densely packed with stories. Yes, they're messy, yes, they're convoluted, but it still has some fragmented story arcs. This game feels as though it's a 5-year-old's playdate. Because of this, Your Honor, I cannot recommend this game. But that is not why we're here, is it?